Ne mangez pas. Ne le mangez pas. The words in French cut through the elegant dinner party like a blade, spoken by a trembling housemaid who had no business interrupting the most important business deal of Victor Harrington's life. But something in her desperate tone made the billionaire tech mogul freeze, with the crystal glass halfway to his lips, the expensive wine suddenly feeling heavy as lead in his hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victor Harrington had built his empire on precision. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every outcome predicted, with the cold efficiency that had transformed him from a middle-class kid from Detroit into one of the most feared corporate raiders on Wall Street. At 53, he commanded a fortune that could buy small countries, owned penthouses in 7 major cities, and wielded influence that made senators return his calls within minutes. His latest acquisition target, Meridian Pharmaceuticals, sat across from him at the mahogany dining table in his Hamptons estate, ready to sign papers that would add another $2 billion to his already staggering net worth. The dinner party had been orchestrated with military precision. Every detail from the imported French chef to the hand-selected wine vintage was designed to create the perfect atmosphere for closing what would be his most lucrative deal yet. Meridian's CEO, Harrison Blackwood, and his team of executives had flown in specifically for this evening, and after months of negotiations, they were finally ready to surrender their pharmaceutical empire to Victor's relentless pursuit. The dining room itself was a testament to Victor's success. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over walls lined with priceless art, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the moonlit Atlantic. The table could seat 20, though tonight only 8 occupied the hand-carved chairs. Victor sat at the head, naturally, with Blackwood to his right and the other Meridian executives arranged strategically around the table. His own legal team flanked his left side, briefcases full of contracts and acquisition papers ready for signatures. Isabella Moreau had been working in the Harrington household for exactly 3 months. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from years of invisible service in wealthy homes, though this position was different from any she had held before. She had arrived from Lyon with impeccable references, speaking perfect English despite her heavy French accent, and had quickly proven herself indispensable to the household staff. What the employment agency hadn't mentioned, and what Isabella had carefully omitted from her application, was that she possessed an unusual sensitivity to certain chemical compounds, a trait inherited from her grandmother, who had worked as a food taster for a prominent French political family in the 1970s. The evening had begun flawlessly. Isabella had supervised the serving of the first 3 courses, ensuring each dish met Victor's exacting standards. The imported oysters, the truffle-infused soup, the perfectly prepared duck confit, everything had proceeded without incident. She had remained in the background, as good help should, observing but not interfering as millions of dollars in business was conducted over dinner conversation. It was during the serving of the main course that Isabella first noticed something was wrong. She had been standing near the kitchen entrance, overseeing the wine service, when a familiar metallic scent caught her attention. It was subtle, barely detectable beneath the rich aromas of the meal, but unmistakable to someone with her particular sensitivity. The smell reminded her of the chemistry lab at the university, where she had briefly studied before financial circumstances forced her into domestic service. More specifically, it reminded her of compounds her grandmother had taught her to recognize and fear. Victor raised his wine glass in a toast to the successful conclusion of their negotiations. The deep red liquid caught the chandelier light beautifully, and Harrison Blackwood smiled as he lifted his own glass in response. The other executives followed suit, ready to celebrate the deal that would make them all considerably wealthier, even as they handed control of their company to the man who had systematically dismantled a dozen other corporations. Isabella's training kicked in with startling clarity. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, lessons taught during long afternoons in their small Lyon apartment. Trust your nose, petite fille. Trust your instincts. When something smells wrong, it usually is wrong. The metallic scent was stronger now, and with it came a sweet undertone that made Isabella's stomach clench with recognition. Without thinking, without considering the consequences to her employment, or her future. Isabella stepped forward from her position near the wall. Protocol demanded that she remain invisible, that she never interrupt her employer's business, that she certainly never address guests directly. But her grandmother's training overrode years of domestic service conditioning. Ne mangez pas, ne le mangez pas. The words burst from her lips in her native French, urgent and desperate. Don't eat that. Don't eat it. The dining room fell silent. 8 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the young French maid who had dared to interrupt the most important business dinner of the year. Victor's hand froze with the wine glass inches from his lips, confusion and anger warring on his features. Harrison Blackwood looked mortified, clearly wondering if this was some elaborate insult to his character or his business practices. What did you just say? Victor's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone that had made grown men weep in boardrooms across the country. Isabella realized she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Her employment, her visa status, her entire future in America hung in the balance. But the metallic scent was stronger now, and her grandmother's training screamed warnings that she could not ignore. Monsieur Harrington, she said, switching to heavily accented English, her voice trembling but determined. Please, do not drink the wine. Something is wrong with it. The silence stretched longer, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Victor slowly lowered his glass to the table, his gray eyes never leaving Isabella's face. She could see him calculating, weighing the interruption against whatever instinct had made him pause when she first spoke. Harrison Blackwood cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should continue with the toast. I'm sure your staff is simply, what exactly do you think is wrong with the wine? Victor interrupted, his attention still fixed on Isabella. Isabella took a deep breath, knowing she was about to sound completely insane to a room full of logical, rational businessmen. I can smell something that should not be there. A metallic scent, with sweetness underneath. It reminds me of... She paused, searching for the English words. Of laboratory chemicals. Poison chemicals. One of Blackwood's executives laughed nervously. This is ridiculous. Are we really going to let the help derail a multi-billion-dollar deal with paranoid fantasies? But Victor wasn't laughing. He was studying Isabella with the same intensity he brought to analyzing quarterly reports and market projections. She met his gaze steadily, despite the fact that her heart was hammering against her ribs. How could you possibly know what poison smells like? He asked quietly. Isabella's throat tightened. This was the part of her history she had hoped never to reveal, the family legacy that had shaped her life in ways she preferred to keep private. My grandmother. She had what you call a gift. She could detect certain chemicals by scent alone. She taught me when I was young, before she died. It saved lives in France, this ability. The room erupted in scoffs and dismissive murmurs from the Meridian executives, but Victor held up a hand for silence. His business instincts, honed by decades of preparing and narrating this story, took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Detecting lies and deception? We're telling him something important. This young woman wasn't trying to scam him or disrupt his deal for personal gain. She was genuinely terrified, and more importantly, she was risking everything to warn him. Margaret, Victor called to his head of household staff, who had appeared in the doorway, clearly mortified by Isabella's behavior. Call Dr. Patterson immediately. Have him come to the house with whatever equipment he needs to test this wine. Victor, this is completely unnecessary. Blackwood began, but stopped when he saw the expression on Victor's face. Humor me, Victor said simply. It won't take long, and then we can continue with our celebration. Isabella remained standing near the table, acutely aware that every person in the room now viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. She had violated every rule of domestic service, had potentially destroyed a deal worth billions of dollars, and had certainly ended her career in the Harrington household. But the metallic scent lingered in the air, and her grandmother's voice continued to whisper warnings in her memory. Dr. Richard Patterson arrived within 40 minutes, carrying a portable chemistry kit that he normally used for analyzing suspicious substances in emergency rooms. Victor had known him for years. ever since Patterson had treated him for a stress-induced ulcer 5 years earlier. The doctor was discreet, reliable, and, most importantly, had the equipment necessary to determine whether Isabella's concerns had any basis in reality. While they waited for the results, the dinner party atmosphere grew increasingly strained. The Meridian executives made polite conversation, but their irritation was palpable. Several $1,000 bottles of wine remained untouched on the table, and the carefully prepared meal grew cold as everyone waited to learn whether they had been moments away from poisoning themselves. Isabella had been dismissed to the kitchen, officially to help with cleanup but realistically to remove her disruptive presence from the dining room. She stood at the sink, mechanically washing crystal glasses while straining to hear any indication of what the doctor might be discovering. Margaret, the head of household staff, kept shooting her disapproving glances, clearly calculating how quickly she could arrange for Isabella's termination and deportation. 25 minutes after beginning his analysis, Dr. Patterson returned to the dining room with an expression that made Victor's blood run cold. "The wine has been contaminated with ricin," Patterson announced without preamble. "Highly concentrated, tasteless, and in sufficient quantity to kill everyone at this table within hours of consumption." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison Blackwood's face went ashen, while his executives began talking over each other in panicked voices. Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze coming through the windows. "Are you absolutely certain?" Victor asked, though he already knew the answer from Patterson's grave expression. "Without question. This is professional-grade poisoning, Victor. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and had access to sophisticated laboratory equipment." Patterson paused, looking around the table at the pale faces. "If you had consumed even a small amount of this wine, you would have died within 12 hours, and it would have appeared to be natural causes. Heart failure, specifically." Victor's mind raced through the implications. Someone had tried to murder him, along with everyone else at the table. The Meridian deal, worth billions of dollars, had provided the perfect cover for assassination. But who had the motive, the means, and the access necessary to contaminate wine in his own home? "I need to speak with Isabella immediately," Victor said, rising from his chair. He found her in the kitchen, still washing dishes with mechanical precision while tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and resignation. "How did you know?" Victor asked, without preamble. Isabella set down the crystal glass she had been cleaning and wiped her hands on her apron. "My grandmother, she worked for the Dubois family in Lyon during the 1970s. Political times were dangerous then, and there were many attempts to poison prominent figures. She developed what the doctors called hyperosmia, an extreme sensitivity to certain chemical compounds. She could detect poison in food or drink before anyone else even suspected danger." "And you inherited this ability?" Isabella nodded. "It has been both blessing and curse for our family. My mother had it too, though not as strongly as Grandmere. She died when I was 16, and Grandmere taught me everything she knew before she passed 2 years later." Victor studied the young woman who had just saved his life. Her employment background had checked out perfectly, her references had been impeccable, and her work performance had been flawless. Yet she possessed a genetic gift that had prevented what would have been one of the most sophisticated assassination attempts in corporate history. "Why didn't you mention this ability when you applied for employment?" he asked. Isabella's laugh was bitter. "Would you have hired someone who claimed to be able to smell poison? Most people think it is fantasy, superstition. I learned long ago to keep this secret, to find work based on my skills as housekeeper, not as some kind of human bloodhound." The kitchen door swung open, and Margaret entered, clearly intending to begin Isabella's termination process. But Victor held up a hand to stop her. "Isabella will be staying," he said firmly. "In fact, she'll be receiving a significant raise and a permanent position in this household." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded and retreated without argument. Victor turned back to Isabella, who was staring at him in disbelief. "You saved my life tonight," he said simply. "More than that, you risked your own future to warn me about something you couldn't prove, something that sounded completely insane to everyone else in that room. "I could not let you die when I knew there was danger," Isabella replied quietly. "Grandmere always said that gifts are given to be used, not hidden." Victor nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. The assassination attempt meant that someone close to him, someone with access to his home and his schedule, had betrayed him. The investigation would be complex and dangerous, and he would need someone he could trust absolutely, someone whose unusual abilities might prove invaluable in detecting future threats. But first, he needed to deal with the immediate crisis. 8 people, including some of the most powerful executives in the pharmaceutical industry, had nearly been murdered in his dining room. The police would need to be called, the FBI would become involved, and his entire world would be turned upside down by the investigation that would follow. As if reading his thoughts, Isabella spoke softly. "There is something else, Monsieur Harrington. The poison. It was not in the wine originally." Victor froze. "What do you mean?" "I smelled the wine when it was first opened, when Henri was decanting it in the kitchen before service. It was clean then, pure. The contamination happened after that, while the wine was already at the table." The implications hit Victor like a physical blow. Someone in his house, someone who had been in the dining room during the meal, had poisoned the wine while everyone was distracted by dinner conversation. The killer wasn't some outside assassin who had infiltrated his staff. It was someone he had trusted enough to invite into his home. Victor's gray eyes hardened as he processed this information. The betrayal cut deeper than the assassination attempt itself. Someone he considered a friend, a business partner, or a trusted employee had tried to murder him and was willing to kill innocent people to achieve that goal. "Can you tell when the poisoning occurred?" he asked Isabella. She closed her eyes, concentrating. "The scent was strongest near the end of the main course, just before I spoke, but it was building throughout the evening. I think perhaps it was added gradually, in small amounts to avoid detection." Victor felt a cold rage building in his chest. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of opportunity. Someone had systematically poisoned his wine over the course of the evening, calculating the dosage to ensure maximum lethality while avoiding immediate detection. It was methodical, professional, and deeply personal. "I need you to think carefully," Victor said to Isabella. "During the evening, did you notice anyone acting strangely? Anyone who seemed nervous, who spent time near the wine service, who behaved differently than usual?" Isabella frowned, replaying the evening's events in her memory. She had been trained by her grandmother to observe everything, to notice details that others might miss. As a domestic worker, she had become expert at reading the moods and motivations of the wealthy families she served. "Monsieur Blackwood," she said slowly. Several times during the evening, he reached across the table near the wine service. I thought perhaps he was adjusting his place setting or reaching for bread, but now that I think about it, his movements were very deliberate. Victor's expression darkened. Harrison Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the man who had been negotiating to sell his company for $2 billion. The man who would have profited enormously from the acquisition, but who might have decided that murdering Victor was preferable to surrendering control of his life's work. But even as the suspicion formed, Victor's analytical mind began poking holes in the theory. Blackwood would have died along with everyone else if they had consumed the poisoned wine. Unless he had planned to avoid drinking it somehow, or unless he had an antidote, his participation in the poisoning seemed unlikely. "Was there anyone else?" Victor pressed. "Anyone who had access to the wine service area?" Isabella considered carefully. "Your business attorney, Monsieur Davidson. He excused himself twice during the meal. Once to take a phone call, once to use the restroom. Both times, he passed very close to the wine service area." Charles Davidson had been Victor's attorney for 12 years, handling mergers and acquisitions worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He knew more about Victor's business practices than anyone else alive, including several deals that had skirted the edges of legality. If Davidson had decided to betray him, he would have both the knowledge and the access necessary to plan the perfect murder. Victor's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patterson. "Police are here. They want to interview everyone immediately." The next several hours would determine not only who had tried to kill him, but also whether Victor could trust anyone in his inner circle ever again. The young French maid who had saved his life had given him a second chance, but that chance would be meaningless unless he could identify the traitor who had betrayed him. As police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer to the Hamptons estate, Victor looked at Isabella with new respect. She had risked everything to save the life of a man she barely knew, a man who could have destroyed her future with a single phone call. Her courage and integrity stood in stark contrast to the calculated betrayal of whoever had tried to poison him. "Isabella," he said quietly, "I want you to stay close to me during the police interviews. Your ability to detect chemical compounds might be crucial to the investigation, and I suspect we're going to discover that tonight was just the beginning of a much larger conspiracy." Isabella nodded, her dark eyes reflecting both determination and fear. She had spent her life hiding her unusual gift, using it only to protect herself and those she cared about. Now, for the first time, she would have to reveal her abilities to law enforcement officials who might view her claims with skepticism or suspicion. But as the sound of police cars grew louder, Isabella thought about her grandmother's final words. "The gift is not meant to be hidden, petite fille. It is meant to protect the innocent, even when doing so requires great courage." Tonight, that courage had saved 8 lives. Tomorrow, it might help expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. Victor Harrington had built his empire on the belief that everything could be measured, calculated, and controlled. He was about to learn that some of the most important truths in life could only be detected by trusting in gifts that defied rational explanation. The dining room where millions of dollars in business had been conducted now resembled a crime scene. Crystal glasses sat untouched on the mahogany table, their contents potentially lethal. The carefully prepared meal remained unfinished, a testament to how quickly wealth and power could become meaningless in the face of mortality. As the first police officers entered the estate, Victor realized that his life had changed irrevocably. The assassination attempt would make headlines around the world, potentially affecting stock prices and business relationships he had spent decades building. But more importantly, it had introduced him to someone whose loyalty and integrity were rarer than any of the treasures he had accumulated. Isabella Moreau had whispered a warning in French that had saved his life. Now Victor Harrington was about to discover just how deep the conspiracy against him reached, and whether the young maid's extraordinary abilities could help him survive what promised to be the most dangerous period of his life. The investigation was about to begin, and with it, a partnership between one of America's most ruthless businessmen and a French maid, whose inherited gift had already proven more valuable than all his billions combined. Detective Sarah Chen had investigated corporate crime for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the scene at the Harrington estate. 8 of the most powerful executives in America had nearly been murdered with ricin-laced wine, and the only reason they were still alive was because a French housemaid had detected the poison through smell alone. As she interviewed the survivors in Victor's oak-paneled study, Chen found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about criminal investigation. Isabella sat rigidly in a leather chair, her hands folded in her lap as she answered Chen's questions with quiet precision. Her English, though heavily accented, was clear and detailed as she described the metallic scent that had triggered her warning. Chen had initially been skeptical of the young woman's claims, but Dr. Patterson's chemical analysis left no room for doubt about the ricin contamination. "Walk me through your grandmother's background again," Chen requested, her pen poised over her notepad. "You mentioned she worked for a political family in France during the 1970s? Isabella nodded slowly. "The Dubois family. Monsieur Dubois was involved in local politics in Lyon, and there were several attempts on his life during those years. Grandmere prevented 3 poisoning attempts that we know of, and possibly others that were never reported publicly." Victor, who had been listening from behind his mahogany desk, leaned forward with interest. Why weren't these incidents reported? Surely attempted murder of a political figure would have made news. "The family preferred discretion," Isabella explained. "Publicizing the attempts would have shown weakness, invited more attacks. Grandmere was well compensated for her silence and for her protection." Chen made notes rapidly, already planning the international inquiries that would be necessary to verify Isabella's family history. The French authorities would need to be contacted, historical records examined, and medical experts consulted about the genetic basis for hyperosmia. The door to the study opened, and Agent Marcus Rodriguez from the FBI entered, carrying a thick file and wearing the grim expression that came with investigating attempted assassinations of billionaires. Rodriguez had flown in from the New York field office within 2 hours of being notified about the ricin poisoning, and his presence indicated that the Bureau was treating this as a matter of national security. "We've completed preliminary interviews with all the potential victims," Rodriguez announced, settling into a chair across from Victor's desk. "Mr. Harrington, I need to ask you directly about any enemies you might have, anyone who would benefit from your death." Victor's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Detective, I've destroyed more companies than most people have worked for. I've bankrupted competitors, absorbed their assets, and eliminated thousands of jobs in the process of building my empire. The list of people who might want me dead could fill a phone book." Rodriguez consulted his notes. "Let's focus on the people who had access to your home tonight. The Meridian Pharmaceuticals executives, your legal team, your household staff, anyone who could have contaminated the wine during the dinner service." Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly struggling with something. Chen noticed the movement and fixed her with an encouraging look. "Is there something else you remember, Isabella? Any detail that might help us identify the perpetrator?" "The poison was added in stages," Isabella said slowly, her accent thickening with nervousness. "Not all at once, but gradually throughout the evening. Whoever did this had multiple opportunities to approach the wine service area without arousing suspicion." Victor's eyes narrowed. "That suggests someone who was moving freely around the dining room, someone whose presence near the wine wouldn't seem unusual." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and began showing crime scene photos to the group. "We've analyzed the seating arrangement and the wine service setup. Based on the positioning, several people had clear access to the contamination site. The photos showed the elegant dining room from multiple angles, with evidence markers indicating where each person had been seated and the path the servers had taken during the meal. The wine service area was clearly visible from several positions at the table, and the lighting had been dim enough to provide cover for subtle movements. Harrison Blackwood had the best access," Rodriguez continued. "His seat was directly adjacent to the wine service area, and witnesses confirm he made several reaching movements during the evening. But he would have died along with everyone else," Victor pointed out. "Unless he planned to avoid drinking the wine somehow, which seems unlikely given the toast we were about to make." Isabella spoke up quietly. "There is something else about Monsieur Blackwood. During the evening, I noticed he kept touching his jacket pocket, as if checking for something. And when we were waiting for Dr. Patterson's results, he excused himself to the restroom for nearly 10 minutes. Chen exchanged glances with Rodriguez. A 10-minute absence during a poisoning investigation was highly suspicious, especially if Blackwood had been carrying something in his jacket that might have been an antidote or protective medication. "We'll need to search Blackwood thoroughly," Rodriguez decided. "If he was carrying an antidote, that would change the entire dynamic of this case." Victor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit Atlantic. The view that usually brought him peace now seemed ominous, as if threats could emerge from the darkness at any moment. "There's another possibility we haven't considered," he said quietly. "What if the real target wasn't me?" The room fell silent as everyone processed this new perspective. Rodriguez set down his tablet and leaned forward intently. "Explain." "The Meridian acquisition has been in negotiation for months," Victor continued, his voice thoughtful. "Several other pharmaceutical companies were interested in acquiring them as well. If Blackwood and his team died during negotiations with me, it would effectively kill the deal and leave Meridian vulnerable to a hostile takeover by someone else." Isabella's eyes widened with understanding. "You think someone wanted to eliminate the Meridian executives, and you were what they call collateral damage?" "It's possible," Victor admitted. "My death would certainly cause chaos in the corporate world, but it wouldn't directly benefit any of my competitors. Eliminating the Meridian leadership while pinning the blame on me, however, could clear the path for another company to acquire their assets at a much lower price." Rodriguez was already reaching for his phone. "I need to run background checks on every pharmaceutical company that was competing for the Meridian acquisition. This changes our suspect pool dramatically." As the FBI agent stepped out to make his calls, Chen continued questioning Isabella about her observations during the evening. The young woman's attention to detail was remarkable, and she had noticed subtle behaviors and movements that the trained security cameras had missed. "Tell me about the staff movements," Chen requested. "You mentioned earlier that you supervised the wine service. Who else had access to that area?" Isabella closed her eyes, mentally recreating the evening's timeline. Henri, the sommelier, decanted the wines in the kitchen before service. Marie and Jacques served the food courses. Margaret supervised from the dining room entrance. And there was someone else, a man I did not recognize, who claimed to be with the catering company. Victor spun around from the window. What man? I didn't approve any additional catering staff. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, carrying what looked like additional wine service equipment, Isabella described. He spoke to Henri briefly in the kitchen, then I saw him near the dining room during the second course. I assumed he was part of the regular catering team. Chen and Victor exchanged alarmed glances. An unidentified man with access to the wine service area represented a significant security breach and potentially the answer to how the poisoning had been accomplished. Can you describe him in more detail? Chen pressed urgently. Isabella nodded, her expression growing more confident. Tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He had a small scar on his left hand, between the thumb and index finger. His accent was American, but with something underneath it. Maybe European originally. Victor was already reaching for his phone to contact his security team. Margaret will have the records of everyone who was supposed to be here tonight. If this man wasn't on the approved list, we need to find out how he gained access to my home. Rodriguez returned to the study with his phone still pressed to his ear, clearly receiving important information from his colleagues. When he ended the call, his expression was grim. We've identified 3 pharmaceutical companies that were competing aggressively for the Meridian acquisition, he announced. Apex Pharmaceuticals, North Star Biotech, and Crimson Industries. All of them have the resources and motivation to orchestrate something like this. Any of them employ a man matching Isabella's description of the unknown catering worker? Victor asked. Rodriguez consulted his notes. Crimson Industries has a head of corporate acquisitions named David Kellerman. 42 years old, 6 feet tall, former military with extensive overseas experience. He's been known to use unconventional methods to secure deals for his company. Isabella's face went pale. That could be him. The bearing, the way he moved, it was very controlled, very disciplined, like military training. Victor felt a cold rage building in his chest. The idea that a corporate rival had infiltrated his home and attempted to murder him for business advantage was both terrifying and infuriating. How do we prove it was Kellerman? We start with the security footage, Rodriguez replied. Your estate has extensive camera coverage. If Kellerman was here tonight, we'll have visual evidence. Chen stood up, closing her notepad. I also want to interview Henri, the sommelier, immediately. If Kellerman spoke to him in the kitchen, Henri might remember details about their conversation that could help us understand how the poisoning was accomplished. As the investigators prepared to examine the security footage and interview the household staff, Victor found himself studying Isabella with new appreciation. Her ability to detect the poison had saved 8 lives, but her observational skills and attention to detail were proving equally valuable to the investigation. Isabella, he said quietly, after tonight, your life is going to change dramatically. The media attention alone will be overwhelming, and if we succeed in prosecuting whoever did this, you'll likely be called to testify in a very high-profile trial. Isabella met his gaze steadily. I understand, Monsieur Harrington, but I cannot regret speaking up, even if it brings complications. Grandmere always said that gifts unused are gifts wasted. Rodriguez returned to the study carrying a laptop computer, his expression indicating that he had found something significant in the security footage. You need to see this, he announced, setting the laptop on Victor's desk and angling the screen so everyone could view it. The video showed the kitchen area during the dinner preparation, with Henri working efficiently to decant the wines for service. At approximately 7:15 in the evening, a tall man in catering attire entered the frame, approaching Henri with what appeared to be casual conversation. That's him, Isabella confirmed immediately. That's the man I saw. The video continued, showing the unknown man handling several wine bottles while Henri was distracted with other preparations. The angle made it impossible to see exactly what he was doing, but his movements around the wine service area were deliberate and purposeful, We need to enhance this footage, Rodriguez decided. The FBI lab can clean up the image quality and potentially identify exactly what substances he was introducing to the wine. Victor watched the video replay several times, his anger building with each viewing. The casual nature of the poisoning, the calculated way the killer had infiltrated his staff and contaminated the wine, demonstrated a level of premeditation that was deeply disturbing. "There's more," Rodriguez said, advancing the video timeline. "Watch what happens at 8:43. The screen now showed the dining room during the meal service, with the unknown man visible in the background near the wine service area. He appeared to be making additional adjustments to the wine service, his movements quick and professional. He was adding more poison during the dinner, Chen observed grimly. Isabella was right about the contamination happening in stages. Isabella leaned forward, studying the video intently. "Grammier taught me that poisoners often use this technique. Small amounts over time to avoid immediate detection, building to a lethal concentration just before consumption." The video evidence was compelling, but Rodriguez knew they would need much more to build a prosecutable case. "We need to identify this man definitively and connect him to one of the competing pharmaceutical companies. The circumstantial evidence is strong, but we need concrete proof of conspiracy and attempted murder." Victor's phone rang, interrupting the video analysis. Margaret's voice was tense and frightened as she reported that Henri, the sommelier, had been found unconscious in his apartment above the estate's carriage house. An ambulance was already en route. The group rushed to Henri's apartment, finding the elderly Frenchman barely conscious and showing symptoms consistent with ricin poisoning. Dr. Patterson, who had remained at the estate to assist with the investigation, immediately began emergency treatment while the paramedics prepared Henri for transport to the hospital. "He must have sampled the wine during preparation," Dr. Patterson explained grimly. "It's common practice for sommeliers to taste wines before service to ensure quality. If he consumed even a small amount of the contaminated wine several hours ago, he would be showing symptoms by now." Isabella knelt beside Henri's stretcher, speaking to him rapidly in French. The dying man's eyes focused on her with recognition, and he whispered something that made Isabella's face go white with shock. "What did he say?" Victor demanded urgently. Isabella's voice was barely audible. "He said the man claimed to be my cousin from Lyon, that he was bringing me a message from family in France. Henri trusted him because he spoke perfect French and knew details about my background that only family would know." The implications were staggering. The killer had not only infiltrated Victor's security, but had researched Isabella's family history and used that information to gain access to the wine service area. This was not a simple corporate assassination attempt, but a sophisticated operation that had taken Isabella's presence in the household into account. Rodriguez was already on his phone, coordinating with Interpol to investigate any connections between the competing pharmaceutical companies and intelligence services that might have access to detailed background information on French nationals. As Henri was transported to the hospital, his chances of survival uncertain, the investigation took on new urgency. The killer had demonstrated a level of planning and resources that suggested this was far more than a business rivalry gone wrong. Victor found himself looking at Isabella with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Her gift had saved his life, but it had also made her a target. The killer had known about her abilities, had planned around them, and had almost succeeded in eliminating the one person who could detect the poisoning attempt. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he told Isabella quietly. "If they were willing to poison Henri to cover their tracks, they won't hesitate to come after you." Isabella shook her head firmly. "I will not hide while people are in danger. If this person is still planning to hurt others, my ability to detect poison could save lives." Chen stepped forward, her detective instincts recognizing the value of Isabella's cooperation. "She's right, Mr. Harrington. Isabella's abilities could be crucial to preventing future attacks. But we'll need to provide her with protection while she assists with the investigation." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "The FBI can arrange a safe house, full protection detail. But I need Isabella to work with our forensic team to identify any other potential contamination sources. If this killer used ricin tonight, he might have access to other chemical weapons." As dawn approached over the Hamptons estate, the investigation was expanding into an international manhunt for a sophisticated killer who had nearly succeeded in one of the most audacious corporate assassinations in American history. Isabella Moreau, the young French maid who had whispered a warning that saved 8 lives, was about to become the key witness in a case that would expose corruption and conspiracy at the highest levels of the pharmaceutical industry. The gift inherited from her grandmother had already proven its value beyond measure. Now, as the investigation deepened, Isabella would discover that her unusual abilities were needed not just to detect past crimes, but to prevent future ones. The killer who had infiltrated Victor's home was still at large, and the pharmaceutical industry was about to learn that some secrets were too dangerous to keep buried. Victor stood at his study window watching the sun rise over the Atlantic and realized that his life had been permanently altered. The young woman who had saved him represented something he had never encountered in his decades of corporate warfare: absolute integrity combined with extraordinary ability. As the investigation continued, he would discover that protecting Isabella from the enemies she had made was only the beginning of understanding what her presence in his life truly meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.